Hello, and today I'm going to be talking about musical notation as a cognitive scaffold, why rhythm supports reading fluency when text alone does not. So what if timing could play a more central role in the way that we learn? Today I'm going to be exploring how making rhythm visible through musical notation can transform reading from a solitary decoding task into a shared embodied experience. I'm going to be drawing on research in neuroscience and in education and showing how rhythm can act as a cognitive scaffold, easing the cognitive load, strengthening attention and nurturing fluency. When children learn through rhythm, they don't just read words, but they connect with meaning and grammar. And thus, they learn to understand through processes that involve time. Let's start off by thinking about why it is that musical notation works when text on its own sometimes does not. Musical notation carries a surprising amount of cultural baggage. For some, it evokes elitism, tradition, or a narrow definition of music making and musical ability. And for others, it raises understandable questions about relevance, transfer, and evidence. And these concerns are not misplaced. Much of the research in this area has been poorly controlled, and too many classroom interventions have reduced notation to isolated drills that strip it of meaning. Today, I'm not here to advocate for more music in the timetable, nor is this a claim that musical notation is a shortcut to literacy. Instead, I'm asking a more modest and I think more useful question. What happens when timing, patterns, and structure are made visible? And why does this sometimes support learning when text alone does not? Let's move on to reading as a timing problem, not just a decoding problem. Recent research suggests that rhythm-based training can be associated with improvements in reading fluency, particularly when timing skills are enhanced. However, the mechanisms involved are not fully understood, and a growing body of evidence shows that musical experiences correlate with the expressive aspects of reading, prosody, and the sensitivity to timing. Rhythm processing deficits are observed among children with reading difficulties, according to researchers. And many studies that have been exploratory have not quite controlled adequately enough for participant characteristics or for the delivery of the intervention. Real-world research that is carried out in actual school settings rather than laboratories is actually difficult to control, and even the most beautifully designed studies suffer from limitations and confounding variables. The idea of having a control group in this kind of study is less straightforward than you might expect. When I first arrived at a secondary school, about to introduce rhythm for reading to a group of 12-year-olds, they already knew what it was involving. They had already heard about it through their friends and their family who were attending other schools. They had also heard that it worked. From a research perspective, the participants had what we call expectancy effects. I was surprised that this had happened, and even though this was part of a randomized controlled trial, the design had been compromised even before we got started. Another real-world research confound in a school setting concerns unexpected events. For example, if Ofsted decide to conduct a full inspection, then a well-controlled study will be affected at multiple levels simultaneously. The interventions, the participants, the link teachers, and the likelihood of any follow-up assessments would either be changed or cancelled. Undeterred, my research has continued in small-scale longitudinal studies that have been embedded into the work of schools where they are taking place. And in this way, expectancy effects and researcher effects are absolutely minimised, and the inspections come and go in the background. Over time, I've observed mechanisms that play out when working with a rhythm-based intervention. There is a model called the Processing Rhythm in Speech and Music framework. It's known as PRISM. and it links precise auditory processing, neural entrainment, and sensory motor coupling to propose why practicing activities involving structured timing may support language and reading, but without implying a simple cause and effect from music notation to literacy. This balance of evidence and mechanism points towards rhythm as a cognitive scaffold rather than a curriculum fad. There are two outstanding issues, though. One is that the framework is based on identifying rhythm-based deficits and disorders, and the other one is that the model requires an empirical basis. Having developed rhythm-based intervention in real schools by working with pupils targeted by teachers for intervention, for me a clear pattern has emerged, and this has prompted me to ask this question. If pupils can build sensitivity to rhythm and make rapid progress in reading through a rhythm-based intervention in only 10 minutes a week, was there really a reading deficit or a timing disorder in the first place? Although I do not see huge shifts in all the children, there is a distinct pattern that shows that weak sensitivity to rhythm might not necessarily denote a disorder or a deficit for a large proportion of the pupils targeted for intervention. Many of these children make statistically significant gains in reading comprehension when compared to standardized data. And once again, this prompts me to question whether the so-called reading comprehension deficit should be so easily remediated. Let's think about patterns and symbols and what the brain needs first. Children arrive at school with sounds in their heads, consisting of songs, jingles, rhymes, stories, admonishments, affirmations, jokes, advertising slogans, and so on. All of these are socially situated, meaning that they are imbued with context and value. We already know that children are very impressionable and they absorb whatever they are exposed to. The problems with learning to read begin when we isolate individual sounds from a pattern, whether that's a single phoneme or a single tone. This decontextualized approach to the teaching of reading works for most, but not all children, and this is why researchers tend to refer to a deficit. When children targeted for intervention work with patterns rather than individual sounds, they are relaxed, they're at ease, and they're even playful. A rhythmic pattern written as musical notes does not present a barrier to them because the pattern anchors them in their natural range of auditory processing. For these children, the barrier arises when they're taught to read and decontextualize single units of information. Here is an example of using patterns without losing the context for auditory processing. Imagine I have introduced two notes beamed together, and I tell the children that these notes are faster than the main beat, and I say, quick, quick. Without me making the association for them, they might associate this pattern with familiar kinds of patterns from early childhood. For example, hearing quack quack in visits to their local duck pond, or their own experience of a quicker pace as they first start to run. Quick quick is memorable and relatable, and the subdivision of the main musical beat into two equal parts is never an issue, because the children already have this pattern not only in their auditory processing and their speech processing, but also their motor processing. So, by trusting the children that the children already have these patterns in their heads and then building clear and relatable associations with symbols, we can establish for these children targeted for intervention a simple way to access the rewarding and motivating experience of fluent reading. Now let's have a little think about cognitive load, prediction, and the limits of print. Most, but not all children, are able to learn to read using conventional phonics-based approaches. Phonemic awareness is, however, weaker in some children as their perception of certain phonemes is incomplete. So if we ask children with an incomplete perception of the smallest sounds of language to synthesize sounds to make a word, it is as if we're asking them to construct a Lego model with key pieces omitted from the pack. And when children read musical notation, phonemic awareness is unnecessary. The children targeted for intervention are relieved of their struggle with phonemes. Similarly, there is no need to recall the shape of each and every letter of the alphabet. as well as the blends and the digraphs that add to the complexity of learning to read. There are only 7 letters to remember in the musical alphabet, and in our programme we only focus on 3 of these at any one time. This vast reduction in cognitive load offers capacity to focus much more on building fluency. So let's now consider rhythm as a predictive scaffold. Having lifted the cognitive load, we can now focus on the aspect of timing. Using an analogy of traffic flow, imagine the stop-start experience of driving in sticky, congested traffic. And now think about building sustaining momentum through a real sense of flow. And this translates perfectly into reading. There are stages that children experience as their reading fluency builds in just a few weeks. At the stop-start stage, they are limited by the amount of information that they are processing. There is little automaticity, and every word is painstakingly built out of its smallest components. When reading musical notation, the same child is reading for half a minute at a time without a single hesitation. This sense of flow builds the feelings of anticipation, reward, and motivation that characterize fluent reading. And most important of all, by building anticipation into reading, the child is able to use top-down processes to forecast candidate words and to predict the likely trajectory of a phrase or a sentence. So let's consider how musical notation can act as a visible timing framework. When we build fluency by reading musical notation, the standardized structure of each musical phrase provides the children with a visible, audible, and kinesthetically experienced cognitive scaffold. This structure acts as a placeholder in time and space. This means that the children are better able to maintain information in mind and to use this same capacity to predict what is coming up next in their reading. Maintaining information in mind creates a context for what is coming up next and provides an opportunity to decode words based on phonological knowledge, word shape, and contextual cues. Musical notation provides a regular phrase structure built on simple and reliable patterns, and this alone is enough to enrich the children's learning and to provide them with the tools that they need to fill in the gaps in their reading through top-down processing. So let's think about making rhythm concrete, shareable, and external. One of the main benefits of reading musical notation is that this can be a group task. Once fluency has been established, the group can read in time with a backing track, and this deepens engagement. It also deepens the level of reward that the children experience. The backing track provides the context for reading the notation, and when this is a group endeavour, there are added benefits of group bonding and being able to move together in time, which can also deepen the experience of reading as it's socially rewarding. So let's think about what happens in a group. Let's particularly focus on group synchrony and the social nature of fluency. As the children read aloud and move in time with the backing track as a group, they become entrained. Entrainment is a natural phenomenon seen in the natural world. From fireflies to orcas, we see all forms of life synchronized to each other and also to the dark light cycle and also to patterns of seasonality. Moving in time is an adaptation which enables so many other species to cover large distances effectively, for example, when they're migrating, and also to coordinate their efforts so as to appear larger and more threatening to a potential predator. The collective effort to sustain these patterns of movement requires minimal conscious effort and attention, and this means that much of the effort can be managed subconsciously. And this is what we might actually refer to as autopilot, which of course is the most stable form of attention. Let's think about entrainment, attention, and shared timing. Of course, adaptations which have evolved to enable the seasonal movement of species or defences to keep us all safe do not really seem to apply to reading. But if we pause for a moment to think about that state we enter when we enjoy a book or get absorbed by a social media platform, we've actually become entrained to the rhythm of the language or the rhythm of digital scrolling. The safety in numbers principle still applies. If we look at football fans and people demanding political change, we see that synchrony, rhythmic chanting, and the principle of staying together in time matters in such situations. Although there would be social rewards, including a sense of belonging, the main components of rhythm-based intervention are anticipating phrase lengths, decoding within a rich and rewarding social context, and also minimizing the cognitive load. And these would not have been met without rhythm. Let's remind ourselves of the three core executive functions: cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control, and working memory. Many people devise rhythm-based interventions in a reductive way. They assume that repetition, pattern, and a steady beat might be sufficient to engage executive functions and to affect change in learning or reading. When we are rhythmically in sync in a conversation, or glued to a screen, or lost in a book, our subjective sense of time changes because we are not effortfully engaged. Rather, we are in a flow state in which effort is minimized and external distractions have been eliminated by inhibitory control. And this frees us up to think more strategically about what we're doing, to apply discernment to decision making, or to infer what might be about to happen in a more nuanced way. And this higher level of reasoning enables us to engage even more deeply with what we are doing, anchoring in the flow state, dilating through time, and amplifying precision if we are performing any kind of highly skilled task. External structures support executive functions of inhibitory control, cognitive flexibility, and working memory. An environment featuring consistent routines and behaviour is known to support healthy child development. However, when children are targeted for an intervention, an external structure can become a cognitive scaffold if the children engage with it socially, physically, and rhythmically through entrainment. So let's now think about why it is that rhythm stabilises attention before reading accuracy improves. When children read musical notation under the conditions of entrainment, they are immersed within a structure that is designed to induce a flow state and to support them in anticipating what is about to happen next. This ebbing and flowing of the given and the new allows children to experience reading fluency, leading to anticipation, motivation, and reward whilst reading. The external structure that they experience while reading musical notation is sufficient to engage top-down contextual processing as they discover that they can read text fluently for the first time. When rhythm is made visible, learning becomes something that children can see, feel, and share. Musical notation transforms from a set of abstract symbols into a living structure that connects sound, movement, and meaning. Without this framework, reading shifts from a solitary act of decoding to a rhythmic social experience that nurtures attention, anticipation, and joy. Perhaps this is what true fluency really is, not just in reading, but in learning itself. Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.